I came home from the hospital 2 days earlier than anyone expected, and when I opened my front door, I heard voices inside my house. Not my daughter's voice, not the television, but strangers, laughing, moving things, like they already lived there. And when I walked into the kitchen, 3 people were taking measurements, my cabinets, my counters, while my son-in-law stood beside them holding a clipboard, and my daughter looked at me the way people do when they've been caught too soon. Then I saw the paperwork spread across my dining table, assisted living brochures, financial estimates, and a document labeled Home Transition Timeline. And in that moment, still weak, still shaking, I realized something cold. I hadn't just come home early. I had walked into a decision my family had already made about my house, my life, and possibly how long they expected me to stay in it. My name is Helen Mercer. In the morning I walked into my kitchen and found strangers measuring my cabinets. I was 64 years old, still weak from a sudden hospital stay, and standing inside the house my husband built with his own hands, a house that had held 34 years of birthdays, quiet Sunday mornings, and the slow rhythm of a life that once felt steady. And as I stood there gripping the back of a dining chair, I felt something inside me shift. Not fear exactly, but the uneasy awareness that something had already changed while I was gone. Because the tall man with the measuring tape didn't stop when he saw me. He just glanced at my son-in-law, Daniel, and quietly continued writing numbers onto a clipboard, while my daughter, Lauren, stepped forward too quickly, her voice soft but tight, telling me I should sit down, that I wasn't supposed to be discharged until tomorrow. And the way she said it made my stomach tighten because it sounded less like concern and more like surprise. And I sat slowly, my legs still unsteady, letting my eyes drift toward the dining table where several folders had been arranged neatly. And even before I reached them, I noticed the brochures, photos of landscaped courtyards, smiling seniors, and bold lettering that read Silverbrook Assisted Living. And I picked one up carefully, asking what it was, and Lauren answered immediately, saying they were just options in case I needed help after my fall. And Daniel nodded, adding that they were only trying to make things easier for me. And I wanted to believe them, I truly did. But then I noticed another document partially hidden beneath the brochures, labeled Preliminary Home Evaluation, and my fingers tightened slightly as I pulled it free, scanning the printed notes about square footage, kitchen upgrades, estimated resale value, and suddenly the room felt quieter, heavier, and I looked up at Daniel asking why there was a resale estimate for my house on my dining table. And he smiled, but it looked rehearsed, telling me they were just being prepared in case I decided to downsize. And the tall man beside him shifted awkwardly, avoiding my eyes. And something about that silence made my chest feel cold, because I remembered small conversations over the past few months. Lauren asking if I still handled the property taxes myself. Daniel mentioning how difficult maintenance must be alone. And I realized those conversations hadn't been casual. They had been steps, quiet ones, building towards something I hadn't fully seen. And I leaned back slowly, letting my eyes move around the kitchen Thomas had rebuilt himself, the cabinets he sanded by hand, the window trim he carved one winter while snow fell outside. And 7 years after his death, I had kept everything the same, because this house wasn't just where I lived, it was where I still felt him, in the creak of the floorboards, in the afternoon light across the table. And as the stranger measured the counter again, he muttered quietly, "Layout's good, renovation would be minimal," and Daniel nodded once. And in that moment, still weak and still trying to steady my breathing, I realized they weren't just thinking about my recovery, they were thinking about what came next. And the worst part wasn't the paperwork or the strangers, it was the look on Lauren's face. Not cruel, not angry, but anxious, like she was already worried about how I would react. And I understood then that this wasn't a spontaneous conversation, it was something they had already discussed, already planned. And my early return hadn't interrupted a visit, it had interrupted a timeline. And as I slowly placed the brochure back on the table, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest, because the house my husband built no longer felt like the safe place I left 3 days earlier. It felt like something people were quietly preparing to take. And I realized that whatever had begun while I was in the hospital, it wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. And if I wanted to understand what they were really planning, I would have to stop being the patient they expected and start paying attention. I didn't argue with them, because sometimes silence reveals more than questions. And as I slowly stood from the dining chair, I told Norin I needed to lie down for a few minutes, letting her guide me toward the hallway like she expected, her hand light on my arm, her voice careful, almost relieved that I wasn't pushing back yet. And I noticed Daniel remained in the kitchen with the strangers, his voice dropping slightly as they continued discussing something about timelines and costs. And that word, timelines, settled heavily in my mind as I walked toward my bedroom, because timelines meant decisions already moving forward. And as I stepped into my room, something small caught my attention immediately. The closet door slightly open, and I always kept it closed, always. And I pushed it open slowly, noticing my sweaters slightly shifted, hangers spaced differently than I left them. And then my eyes moved to my dresser where my jewelry box sat crooked, and a quiet chill moved through me. Because nothing was missing, but someone had clearly been searching, carefully, deliberately. And my gaze lifted toward the wooden hook beside my mirror, the one where I always kept the spare key to Thomas's study, and my breath caught slightly, because the hook was empty, and that key hadn't moved in years, not once. And suddenly, everything connected. The strangers in my kitchen, the home evaluation paperwork, the assisted living brochures, and now the missing key. And I felt my pulse quicken despite the lingering weakness in my legs, because Thomas's study wasn't just another room. It held documents he had carefully organized before he passed, insurance papers, financial records, and a folder he once told me to open only if something ever felt wrong. And standing there now, with the key missing, I realized someone else might already be trying to access whatever he left behind. And as I stepped back into the hallway, I heard voices near the front door, and I froze when I saw my neighbor, Margaret Lawson, standing quietly inside, her umbrella folded beside her, her expression tightening slightly when she saw my face. And she asked softly if I had just returned home, and I nodded, explaining I had been discharged early. And she glanced toward the kitchen, lowering her voice to tell me she'd noticed unfamiliar cars parked outside my house for nearly 2 hours. And that alone made my chest tighten, because Lauren had told me they had just arrived. And I explained quietly that strangers were inside measuring my kitchen. And Margaret's brows furrowed immediately, and she leaned closer, asking if I had signed anything yet. And I shook my head, and she nodded once, serious now, telling me not to sign anything until I fully understood what was happening, explaining she'd worked as a legal assistant for decades and had seen families pressured into quick decisions after health scares. And her words settled heavily in my chest, because that's exactly what this felt like, pressure disguised as care. And as we stood there, Daniel's voice carried faintly from the kitchen again, mentioning paperwork and scheduling, and Margaret's eyes met mine. And without needing to say anything, we both understood something wasn't right. And I glanced toward Thomas's study door at the end of the hallway, telling her quietly about the missing key, and her expression sharpened immediately. And she asked if Thomas had ever mentioned a spare, and I hesitated, remembering something faint, a conversation years earlier about emergencies. And just as I turned toward the hallway closet, I realized something else. Whatever Daniel and Lauren had planned, they hadn't expected me to come home yet. And that meant I still had time to understand what Thomas left behind before they did. And if you've ever felt that quiet moment when something in your life suddenly doesn't feel right, Stay with me, because what I discovered next didn't just change their plan. It changed who actually controlled the house and why they were in such a hurry. I waited until the voices in the kitchen softened again before I moved toward the hallway closet, my legs still unsteady, but my mind sharper than it had been all morning. And Margaret stayed beside me quietly, her presence steady, while I opened the small cabinet above the shelf where Thomas used to keep spare batteries and tools. And for a moment, I saw nothing unusual, just the same flashlight, an old measuring tape, and a small box of nails. But then I noticed the flashlight sitting slightly farther back than usual, and when I reached behind it, my fingers brushed against something taped carefully to the inside wall, and my breath caught as I pulled free a small envelope with my name written in Thomas's handwriting, the familiar slope of his letters instantly tightening my chest, because I hadn't seen that handwriting in 7 years. And I opened it slowly, finding a small brass key and a folded document inside. And as I unfolded the paper, my pulse quickened when I read the heading, Revocable Living Trust, Property Protection Clause. And the legal language took a moment to settle in, but the meaning became clear. Thomas had placed the house into a trust years before he died, granting me full lifetime occupancy and decision control, but also specifying that the property could not be sold, transferred, or refinanced without my direct consent and independent legal review, a safeguard designed specifically to prevent pressure during illness, financial strain, or emotional vulnerability. And suddenly, the urgency I'd felt all morning shifted into quiet clarity, because whatever Daniel and Lauren had been preparing couldn't move forward without me, and more importantly, Thomas had anticipated exactly this kind of moment. And I unlocked the study door slowly, stepping inside the familiar scent of cedar and paper, where Thomas's desk sat just as he left it. And inside the top drawer, I found a neatly labeled folder with copies of the trust documents, along with a short letter addressed to me. And I read it quietly, Thomas explaining that he had created the trust not because he distrusted anyone, but because he understood how quickly fear, medical bills, or unexpected stress could push families into decisions they later regretted. And he wrote that the house was meant to be my security, not leverage. And if I ever felt rushed or uncertain, I should take time, ask questions, and remember that love should never come with pressure. And when I stepped back into the hallway holding the document, Lauren and Daniel had already moved closer, their expressions tense. And Lauren asked softly what I'd found. And I explained calmly that Thomas had placed the house in a trust and that no sale, transfer, or refinancing could happen without my full consent and independent legal review. And the shift in the room was immediate. Daniel's posture softening, the strangers quietly gathering their materials, and Lauren's eyes filling with tears, because in that moment the pressure dissolved, replaced by something quieter, more honest, and she admitted softly that they had been worried about my fall, about me living alone, about the cost of future care, and that fear had pushed them into planning too quickly. And I reached for her hand gently, telling her I understood fear, but decisions about home and life deserved patience, not urgency. And Daniel nodded quietly, apologizing for moving too fast. And as the strangers left and the front door closed, the house settled back into silence, the familiar light stretching across the floor Thomas repaired years ago. And I realized then that Thomas hadn't just built this house with wood and nails. He had built protection into its future, quietly, carefully, the way he always handled important things. And sometimes love isn't loud. Sometimes it's a decision made years earlier, waiting quietly until the moment you need it most. And if this story made you think about the people who quietly protect you, even when they're no longer here, Take a moment today to reach out to someone you love, because the strongest safeguards in life often come from the people who think ahead for us. And if you connect with stories about family, trust, and the quiet decisions that change everything, don't forget to follow and stay with me, because sometimes the moments that almost take everything away are the ones that remind us what truly belongs to us.